7. In Acts chapter 7, we're going to watch and see what the reality of this Christian walk really means. And in chapter 7, we're going to look at the defense of Stephen as he faces against the world, as he faces against the religious elite and the accusations that they have against him. Now, today we're going to go over the first 14 verses. We're going to do it in two large chunks. First, we're going to read verses 1 through 8 to help us get our bearings to understand the beginning of this beautiful, large defense that Stephen will give. And then we will finish up the rest of the verses later on in our time together. So we're going to start reading in verse 1. I'm going to read down to verse 8, and we'll see where the Lord takes us today. So Acts chapter 7, starting in verse 1. The high priest said, "Are these things so?" And he said, "Hear me, brethren and fathers. The Lord of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he lived in Haran, and said to him, 'Leave your country and your relatives and come into the land that I will show you.' Then he left the land of the Chaldeans and settled in Haran. From there, after his father died, God had him move to this country in which you are now living. But he gave him no inheritance in it, not even a foot of ground. And yet, even when he had no child, he promised that he would give it to him as a possession, and to his descendants after him. But God spoke to this effect, that his descendants would be aliens in a foreign land, and that they would be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years. And whatever nation to which they will be in bondage, I myself will judge, said God. And after that they will come out and serve me in this place. And he gave him the covenant of circumcision, and so Abraham became the father of Isaac, and circumcised him on the 8th day. And Isaac became the father of Jacob, and Jacob of the 12 patriarchs." Chapter 7 begins, and we pick up with the scene that we left off in chapter 6, with the false accusations against Stephen. Stephen had been grabbed and arrested, placed before the religious elite. He's standing before the council in that place. And before we look at the false accusation and then Stephen's defense, please look for a moment at Acts 6:15. Acts 6:15. As Luke tells us that as the council looked at Stephen as he stood there before them, they saw his face, that it was like that of an angel. Now skip all the way down to Acts 7:58. Acts 7:58, and look at this one name that is sitting in that verse. This one name of this very important person to us, Saul, who is Saul of Tarsus, who will become the Apostle Paul. Now, I want to point that out because I need you to understand that Luke isn't here in this moment. Luke is not an eyewitness of this trial in Stephen's defense. We discussed this in our introduction of Acts, that Luke was not an eyewitness of many of these things. He will become an eyewitness starting in chapter 16 of Acts, which is why the pronouns will suddenly change. It'll go from they were doing this and that to we were doing this and that, because now he's part of the group with Paul. This eyewitness account that we see here in chapter 7 is based on those eyewitnesses that Dr. Luke personally interviewed, which is a detail we know from Luke 1:3. So what we see here is an eyewitness account of the Apostle Paul. And as he recounts the events, he described the face of Stephen as being like that of an angel. Now, we don't know exactly what he means by this description. Was he describing the serene look of peace and confidence in the heart of Stephen for Jesus? Was he saying that the face of Stephen was shining the way that Moses' face did after Moses communed with God on Mount Sinai? We don't know. But what we can be sure of is that this moment was powerful for the Apostle Paul. Paul will never forget Stephen. Stephen will always matter to him. This moment, this memory is burned into his head. And he will even mention Stephen in Paul's own personal defense in Acts chapter 22, as he is standing before those who wanted to see him dead. And he recalls his sin when Stephen was martyred and stoned to death. The importance of Stephen to Paul is likely why this address by Stephen is included in its entirety, and it's the longest recorded message in the entire book of Acts. It's not the address given by Peter on Pentecost. It's not one of the awesome teachings by Paul. It's this one. I mean, when we looked at Peter's address on Pentecost, he says all this stuff, and then at a certain point, Luke just kind of goes, and he said other stuff like this. But Stephen's is different. All of the message is here. It's longer than any other address. It's the longest one in the book of Acts, and this is why it's so important. It's the last great message to all the Jewish people before persecution begins. That means this message is what they will rebel against. This message is what they're going to reject with persecution and fire and death. When Paul goes out and he's breathing threats against the Christians, this is the message that he's going to kick away. In Acts chapter 6, verse 13 and 14, we see the charges against Stephen. This is what the false witnesses claim. They claim that Stephen was spreading the message of Jesus, which is true. But they also claim that Stephen said that Jesus wanted to destroy the temple. Jesus wanted to alter the customs that Moses had handed down to them, but that's false. Now, understanding these charges from the previous chapters is useful to us because it will help guide us as we go through chapter 7. Because there's going to be moments as we study this long defense that we're going to start to wonder, what is Stephen talking about? What does any of this matter to what we're doing right now? But the reason that Stephen is responding at all to the charges is because the religious elite have this mindset that they're protecting the temple and the law, but both the temple and the law talk of Christ. Everything is designed to point the finger to Jesus, to point the arrows to Jesus. It was all designed to tell them about him. Only Jesus matters. But the council had rejected him. Overall, Stephen's entire message is going to be composed of a history lesson, verses 2 through 50, and then a confrontation with the religious elite, verses 51 through 53. The history lesson itself breaks down into three nice, easy parts. There's the patriarchs. Then we have Moses in verses 20 through 43. And then the tabernacle in the last few verses of the history lesson. In verse 2 here of chapter 7, Stephen goes all the way back to the very beginning of the nation. Before the temple, before the law, he goes all the way back to Abraham. Because what he understands is the beginning for Israel was not their time in Egypt. It wasn't the Passover. It wasn't when they came out. It wasn't when they crossed the Red Sea. It wasn't even when they received the law at Mount Sinai. For them, the beginning goes all the way back to a call. A call from the God of glory to Abraham, a call that should be familiar to all Christians now. It was the call of God to his beloved to leave everything behind and follow me. As Stephen unfolds this moment, he brings up Abraham's beginning was in Mesopotamia. We sometimes forget that. Specifically, he came from the land of the Chaldeans. That's in verse 4. The detail matters. Calling it by this specific name matters because as we saw throughout the book of Jeremiah, the Chaldeans were synonymous with the Babylonians, and the Babylonians were the ones who dragged us off into captivity, who took us from our land in bondage and in chains. And with that little detail, Stephen starts to knock the religious elite off their pious high horses. Now, here's what I mean. In verse 3, the call of God to Abraham was for Abraham to leave his country, to go to a land that God would show him. That's the call. But we know from Genesis 11 and Stephen's message here, Abraham didn't follow all he was told. He followed part of the way. He went part of the way, but he didn't go the entire way. You see, at the time that Abraham was called, his father, Terah, was still alive. And while Abraham was called by God, he allowed his father to dictate just the extent of his obedience, how far he would go. So instead of going all the way to Canaan, all the way to the promised land, he went about halfway. He went to the city that would be called Haran, and he stayed there until his father passed away. Then, Acts chapter 7, verse 4, God had to move Abraham from where Abraham had settled and moved him to the land where the Israelites are now. Now, here's the point of all of that. From the very beginning, the history of Israel is characterized by two things: the problematic obedience of the people and the faithfully fulfilled promises of God. The problematic obedience of the people, they did most of the things part of the way, but then God fulfilled all the promises that he made. God doesn't make promises and then break them. He keeps all the promises that he makes. And when you understand that, what you learn is that the history of Israel is the living embodiment of 2 Timothy 2:13, that if we are faithless, he remains faithful. He cannot deny himself. He will not break a promise that he makes. When we look at this, when I say this, I'm not trying to elevate Christians above the Jews. Like, man, they were a mess, but good thing he's got us. Because who's he talking to in 2 Timothy? He's talking about us. This is a letter for Christians. The words of Paul are meant to keep us humble, to keep us grounded. And Stephen was trying to do that for the religious elite too. He's reminding them, Abraham wasn't perfect. The very first one of us got it wrong. And yet still, God made him a promise that God would keep and Abraham would believe in, even though Abraham would not get to be the one to receive the fullness of what God had in store for him. A wonderful teacher once put it this way: God promised Abraham 3 things. He promised him a Lord, he promised him a line, and he promised him a land. He promised him a Lord, the Messiah would come through him. Through you, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. He promised him a line of descendants. Abraham had no kids, and God tells him that I'm going to give you so many kids, so many descendants, that if you could number the sands of the sea, you can number how many kids you're eventually going to have. And he promised him a land, a promised land, a land that he would not know, but that God would show him. Now, in Stephen's message here in Acts chapter 7, Stephen does not specifically mention the Messiah at this point. He talks about the line and he talks about the land. But that's the power of his defense. You see, when you look through everything, what you find is that Jesus is the undercurrent of the entire defense. He is the reason that everything exists. He's the one that's holding all of this together. So when he gets to the climax of the message in chapter 7, verses 51 through 53, then he springs them on them. This has all been about Jesus. He's the only one that matters. He's what this has all been about. In verse 4, we see that Abraham has moved to Canaan, and he dwelt in the land that he was promised, but he was not allowed to possess it. So he's going to be the sojourner, this pilgrim, this visitor almost to this land. He's going to move around it, knowing someday it'll be ours, but it's not mine yet. That might seem a little cruel to us, but Abraham never has a problem with that. There's this one part of the covenant, though, that he does struggle with. It messes with his head that God had promised Abraham this huge line of descendants. But as of Genesis 15, Abraham didn't have even one kid. So how are you going to keep this promise to me when I don't have a child of my own? Now, in chapter 15, God reassures Abraham that one day you will have a child of your own. He has this covenant that he does with Abraham in Genesis 15, proving that God himself was going to keep this for him. And he tells him that before your line occupies this land, I'm going to go ahead and tell you what's going to happen to them. They're going to go to a foreign country for a while. They're going to be oppressed in that place. For 400 years, they're going to be in a land that is not their own, but one day I will rescue them. I will judge those who have oppressed my people. And I will bring them out of there, and they will serve me here. In verse 8, Stephen reminds the religious elite that Abraham received the covenant of circumcision in Genesis 17. And as you look at this flow, that detail seems to come out of nowhere. I mean, we're talking about Abraham, we're talking about promises, and we're talking about promises of land and line, and all of a sudden he starts talking about circumcision. You're like, what does this have to do with any of that? It seems like it's out of place until you realize what happens between the promise in Genesis 15 and the covenant circumcision in 17. Because between the two of those is chapter 16. And what happens in that chapter is that Abraham and his wife Sarah decided that God needs our help. Now, at that time, Abraham and Sarah hatched this little plan. Abraham's about 85 years old. Sarah's 75. And she was worried that we're way too old for us to ever have kids of our own. So Sarah asked Abraham, have sexual relations with my maidservant, the Egyptian Hagar. And he does, and from that union, Hagar gave birth to Ishmael. And we might think, well, that's great. He's finally got a kid. Ball's rolling. Now we're cooking. But there's a problem. You see, with this action and with this union and with this child, they have put the entire plan of salvation into jeopardy. Because the Messiah cannot come from this union. God had a plan. It had to be kept intact. You see, in biblical typology, Egypt represented the world. It's not that God has something against Egyptians. But inside of the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament, Egypt represented going back to the world for your strength, going back to your world for your salvation. The world is what we were rescued from. We were lost in bondage and chains to our sin, and God came to us while we were still in our sin. He rescued us from that, and he gave us a place to belong. Egypt is what we were rescued from. How could the Messiah ever come from this compromise between the people of God uniting themselves with the world? But both Abraham and Sarah are struggling. They don't know how the plan of God is going to work. They want to trust God, but they're struggling to trust God. But the Messiah cannot come through Hagar, and it's not because God didn't love Hagar. Contrary to that, one of the most beautiful names for God is shared with us through Hagar, because she is the one, and she is the one who gives voice to that understanding that our God is the God who sees. And that name comes through her and nobody else. God loved Hagar. He had a plan for her too. But he also had a plan for Sarah. And God was not okay with the blessing going around Sarah, for Abraham being included, but Sarah not. And that's why that union could not be blessed. The Messiah could not come from them. God wants to bring the Messiah through Abraham and Sarah, but they have defiled their relationship. And after that sexual defilement, God has the 99-year-old Abraham get circumcised, because the relationship has to be purified. When he brings them back together, they have to be clean. The Messiah must come through a union that was purified, and an outward circumcision indicated the inward purification of his heart. But that doesn't mean that the line doesn't continue to have issues. It doesn't happen that he does this and then there's no more problems and everyone else is good. We have studied through the history of Israel. We know that they're going to have huge, huge issues all the way their history, all the way to the group that's sitting in front of Stephen right now in chapter 7. Which is why when he starts talking directly to them in verse 51, he goes, "You are uncircumcised in heart. You followed the law, you kept the covenant, but you totally missed the point. Because your hearts are still defiled. They're filthy before God. And God cannot do and bring through you what he wants to, because this on the inside is filthy and dark." In verse 8, Stephen goes from Abraham to Isaac and Jacob in one fell swoop. I mean, he just runs through 3 decades of people. But then he comes here. In verse 9, he starts talking about the sons of Jacob that are called the patriarchs. They're called the patriarchs because the nation of Israel as a whole, they all relate themselves back to these 12 sons. But there's an issue. 10 of these sons are going to have big, big problems of their own. Verse 9, please. In verse 9, the patriarchs became jealous of Joseph and sold him into Egypt. Yet God was with him and rescued him from all his afflictions and granted him favor and wisdom in the sight of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And he made him governor over Egypt and all his household. Now a famine came over all Egypt and Canaan, and great affliction with it. And our fathers could find no food. But when Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent our fathers there the first time. On the second visit, Joseph made himself known to his brothers, and Joseph's family was disclosed to Pharaoh. Then Joseph sent word and invited Jacob, his father, and all his relatives to come to him, 75 persons in all. As we mentioned, Stephen goes from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob very quickly, right? So he just runs through those generations. But then he kind of stops with the 12 sons of Jacob. But in those 12 sons, in verse 9, he focuses on just one, Joseph. At first glance, it may again seem a little bit odd. I mean, why Joseph? He's not the oldest. The Messiah doesn't come from his line. I mean, King David doesn't even come from his line. So what's going on? History lesson first. Abraham is the father of 2 kids, if you remember, Ishmael and Isaac. Ishmael did not care about the things of the Lord. Isaac had a heart for God. Isaac was the son of promise, and Isaac will have 2 sons. He has 2 sons. One is Esau and one is Jacob. Now, Esau has no heart for the Lord whatsoever. At one point, he's a little hungry and he decides to sell his birthright as the oldest child. The only time he really cares about the things of the Lord is when he doesn't get to have the good blessing. He has to have this kind of really weird bad blessing. And he's mad about that because he didn't care about God, but he sure wanted the stuff. But Jacob, for all his issues and all his sins, he had a heart for the Lord. Jacob was a sneaky, conniving individual, desperately flawed. But that one thing that you must admit about Jacob is that the things of God mattered to Jacob. Jacob went on to have 4 wives, which sounds worse than it was. He didn't want 4 wives. He wanted one. He was passionately in love with Rachel. When he saw her, he was willing to work for 14 years for the right to get to marry her. But sneaky Jacob ran into a superior, and he ran into sneaky Laban, who was more sneaky than Jacob, and Laban managed to trick Jacob into marrying the older daughter instead of the younger daughter, Rachel. Well, what happens is over time, these two start fighting for the affections and the attention of Jacob, and through these machinations going back and forth, he ends up being married to their maidservants as well, and he ends up with 4 wives. That's 12 sons by 4 wives. But Rachel was always his favorite. He always loved her the most. And Rachel would have 2 sons, Joseph and Benjamin. And as the firstborn of his favorite wife, Joseph was his favorite. Joseph should have known better. He grew up in a household where dad had a favorite and was not the choice of God. He should have known better to make it so obvious that he preferred Joseph, but he didn't hide it at all. He didn't hide the fact that he preferred Joseph to the other 10 sons by the other 3 wives, and those other 10 sons hated Joseph. It didn't help that young Joseph was just a tiny bit snotty, as the younger sibling will do. Not know exactly when to be quiet. Sometimes you got to just keep stuff to yourself, but Joseph couldn't help it. If he thought it, he said it. God was giving him dreams, and those dreams indicated that one day his older brothers were going to bow down to him, and they did not like that. We're the older. We're going to bow down to you, and because of their jealousy, they sought to kill Joseph. And when they had the chance, when they were far away from home, they grabbed him and threw him into a pit, intending to kill him. Instead of killing him, they ended up selling him to a caravan of Ishmael's descendants. So a group of their cousins are driving by, and they're like, where are you going? Egypt? You're like, here, take him, give us money. And they sell him into slavery, into a caravan that is going down to Egypt. But that's not the end of their duplicity. They go even farther. You see, their father, Jacob, had given Joseph this beautiful coat. And so they take the coat from Joseph and they douse it in the blood of a goat, and then they bring it to their dad and they say this, tell us this if this is the coat of your son. And Jacob breaks down mourning, thinking that his son had been killed. Joseph was sold into slavery in Egypt from the caravan. He was a righteous young man. He refused a woman's sexual advances, and because of that, he was thrown into an Egyptian prison. Betrayed by his brothers, lied about and thrown into jail. He must have felt so alone, but God never left him. Verse 9, God never left him. Yet God was with him to deliver him. And that's what Stephen tells us. God was with him. He rescued him from all his affliction. God granted him favor and wisdom in the sight of Pharaoh. For all that Joseph was going to, as long as he felt, God never stopped looking at him. And he elevates him in the sight of the king of Egypt. And when Pharaoh saw the quality of Joseph and how the wisdom of God was upon him, Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of the entire country. Joseph outranked everybody. He was second only to the king. After 7 years of being out of prison, a terrible famine fell upon the Middle East. That famine is why Joseph was put in charge. You see, when he was still back in jail 7 years prior, God had given Pharaoh a series of dreams that really messed with his head. He woke up, was really upset, and none of his sages or wise people were able to figure it out. Nobody knew what the dreams meant until Joseph was summoned. Joseph explained what the dreams meant. He understood that what God was doing was he was showing Pharaoh what was about to happen, that they were about to have 7 years of plentiful harvest. They were going to have so much money and so much abundance. No one had ever seen the like of it before. But those 7 years of plenty were going to be followed by 7 years of famine. And the famine would be so severe that they would forget they ever had plenty at all. But if they were wise now, if they were not wasteful during the 7 years of plenty, if they set a little bit aside, they would be preserved through the years of famine. Pharaoh was so impressed by this answer, he put Joseph in charge of everything. And because of Joseph's shrewd management, word spread. There is food nowhere else in the world, but there's food back in Egypt. So if you want food, you have to go there. Jacob, Joseph's father, sent the 10 sons of the 3 wives down to Egypt to buy food. When his brothers arrived, they didn't recognize Joseph. They thought he was just an Egyptian. It had been so many years, he looked totally different. He was dressed like an Egyptian, but Joseph recognized them. Because Joseph couldn't be sure of their hearts, he decided to test them to see what his brothers were like. You know, he understood this. When Joseph was there, he had been Dad's favorite, but Joseph was gone, so now Benjamin was his favorite. Does that mean that the brothers have been picking on Benjamin during this time? Because I remember how they were when I was still there. Had they repented and turned away? Or were they now just taking their ire and their angst out on their baby brother? Joseph tested them, but what he learned is that the brothers had changed. They had repented of their sin. They regretted what it is that they had done. These brothers were different from the ones who had thrown him into the pit. And rather than picking on Benjamin, what we see now is the very brother who thought up the plan to sell Joseph into slavery. He's the very one who offers himself as ransom for Benjamin. And he says, don't take my baby brother. Take me instead. Let my baby brother go home. This is a totally different group of guys than what Joseph remembered. And when he hears this and he sees this, it was joy upon joy to his heart. He cries out and says to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? The brothers were overwhelmed. They had repented of their sin, but here they are face to face with the victim of what they had done. But Joseph draws them close. They come close to him, and he starts to speak kindly to them, and he says, don't be upset. Don't be depressed. Because God put me here so that one day I could save you. This is why Stephen mentions Joseph. The Messiah will not descend from the line of Joseph. But Joseph is so special in the Old Testament because next to the tabernacle, there is no better picture of Jesus in the Old Testament than the life of Joseph. All those images, all those people, not even David or Solomon will come close. The tabernacle is number one. Everything in it speaks about Jesus, but Joseph comes second. In every aspect of his life, everything that kid went through tells us about the one we love. There are so many similarities between Jesus and Joseph. Just like Jesus, Joseph was hated by his brothers. Just like Jesus, Joseph suffered many afflictions that he did not deserve. Just like Jesus, Joseph desired to avoid the trial before him, but just like Jesus, because Joseph surrendered to the will of God, because of his obedience, God was able to place him in the one place on the entire earth where he could save his people from death. Just like Jesus, the brothers encountered Joseph in 2 different visits. In the first visit, he didn't fully reveal himself. But in the second, he revealed the fullness of who he was. And Jesus will do the same thing in his second coming. And just like the brothers of Joseph mourned when they realized that this is the one that we did this to, the Jewish people will weep when they look upon him who they pierced. And then in that moment, they will break down and cry because they realize we are the ones who did this to him. In Joseph, the 75 members of the family of Jacob were able to find safety and able to find grace. And under his protection, they would thrive into the million-people nation that they would one day become. And that's why Stephen is teaching the religious elite about Joseph. Because what he really wants to do is he wants to tell them about Jesus. He wants to tell them about the one who came down from heaven, who died on a cross, and he did all of that so he could save all of us. Father, we love you. I praise you for your word, Lord.